Okay, welcome back. Last lecture of week seven. Week seven, part two. Again, reading quizzes, chapter 12, 13, due Sunday. 13 is mostly going to be covered in this lecture. Chapter 12 was covered in the last lecture. Very nice. All right. So we talked about this Keynesian guy a bit last time. This Keynesian guy was famous. Keynes, he said, in the long run, we're all dead. Right. We talked about how that relates with the fiscal policy and what we can do. Um, but there was a big thing that happened during the 30s, 40s, and 50s called the classical versus Keynesian perspectives. There's a big debate in macroeconomics. These two guys that leaded each of these approaches, they were not buddies because they just had different views on how to fix kind of the same problem. So the economy displays short-run cyclical patterns over time. The question that divides these two groups is how can we explain the cycles and to what extent can we moderate them? So classical is going to have a different approach. Keynesian is going to have different approach as well. So we're going to go into those, dive into those, what's the differences, all that above. So Keynesians tend to focus heavily on aggregate demand and trying to understand the business cycle. So it's often referred to as demand side economics. The idea is that firms produce as a response to existing demand. Therefore, demand drives production. In my view, this kind of makes sense. So they are all about demand here. We're not talking about how can we help the suppliers, how can we make it easier for them to produce. We're just saying as long as we can get customers in the door for your coffee shop is going to do well, and you'll figure out how to make the coffee. So, what causes demand fluctuations? Well, a decrease is going to be caused by, rising taxes, falling income, desire to save more, which is something the government cannot really control. The government can control reduction in government spending, increases in taxes, and then the investment is kind of like we talked a little bit about this with the loanable funds. But if you have a drop in business confidence, it's not going to make the aggregate demand go up because now businesses are not willing to invest. Rise in the interest rate is also going to cause investment to fall. And then net exports means we have a decrease in foreign demand. So the relative prices increases for US goods. It's a nice table if you want to look at it. We're going to kind of move on. So the Keynesian perspective is aggregate demand is not always automatically high enough to provide firms with an incentive to hire enough workers to reach what we call full employment. So the macro economy may adjust only slowly to shifts in aggregate demand because of sticky wages and prices, which are wages and prices that do not respond to decreases or increases in demand. So typically we assume that we do have sticky wages and prices. It is not ever occurred where we walk into the job every week and then your manager looks at the economic conditions and he says, actually, today you get $11 instead of $10. And then you walk in the next day and he says, well, the economy kind of turned, so now you get $8. It's not really how it works. Usually we have like a set agreement of, look, I'm going to hire you and you are going to get $10 an hour. And then in a year, we'll revisit it, right? So that's a sticky wage because the wage is kind of fixed for a year. So to deal with these problems, the Keynesians suggest various kinds of government interventions. Um, and then this kind of spawned what's called the Phillips curve. So, shout out Bill Phillips. He came up with this Phillips curve. He noticed that during recession, inflationary pressures are low, but when the level of output is or even pushing beyond potential GDP, the economy is at a greater risk for inflation. So, if GDP is greater than the planned output, then your unemployment tends to be low. GDP is less than that, your unemployment tends to be high. Okay, so there's a trade-off between inflation and unemployment. If you inflate the currency, you can reduce unemployment. if you have to reduce inflation, you should expect to see an increase in unemployment. So during the oil crisis in the 1980s, uh, Ronald Reagan took over and he's like, we are going to tackle inflation first. And we are not going to worry about unemployment because we have to tackle inflation first. Inflation's a big thing. We want to keep it low in an economy. So what they said is we'll tackle inflation, unemployment we expect to rise, but then over time we'll fix that. Okay, so here's the Phillips curve, right? If we have a high unemployment rate and a high in or then we would expect a low inflation rate. Alternatively, when inflation's high, we expect unemployment to be low. Okay. I'm sure we'll talk about it. Yes. Okay. So we do have this thing called stagflation, which kind of ruined this Phillips curve. This Phillips curve was great. It worked for 20 years or so. And then during the 70s, we had this big crisis. And what happens is we had stagflation. So stagflation is unemployment goes up and we have an increase in inflation. So it's a nightmare scenario. It happened all over the world during the 70s, and then this didn't bode well for the Phillips curve. So if we go back to our Phillips curve, what kind of happened was we were, say, right here at A, and then we just went to C, right? And nothing caused this thing to shift. It should not have shifted. So it just kind of broke the Phillips curve, right? And now, when I talked about this Ronald Reagan was at a point where he was like, okay, I'm here. I can tackle inflation or I can tackle unemployment. I cannot fix both at the same time. I cannot go back to A. Okay. We don't have the tools to do that. Um, so when it comes to the Phillips curve, we're going to interpret it as a downward sloping, uh, valid for short run periods of several years. Over longer periods, when aggregate supply shifts, the downward sloping Phillips curve can shift so that unemployment and inflation are both higher. This happened in the 1970s and early 80s, or both lower, as in the 90s or first decade of the 2000s. So the Phillips curve works in the short run, but not in the long run. It's kind of what we concluded. There's a more complex Phillips curve that we use in like graduate macroeconomics for the big boy models. We're not really going to get into it, but I think this is a good rule of thumb that this usually works for short run periods if we're trying to fix a problem right now. But in the long run, this Phillips curve isn't going to work exactly how we would like it to. So the Keynesian perspective, again, um, they're in favor of temporary adjustments to fiscal policy, whether that be expansionary or contractionary. Expansionary is going to be used to get us out of a recession. Contractionary will help us get out of an inflationary expansion. Remember, inflation that's high is not good for an economy. In the short run, both of these exhibit the inflation unemployment trade-off, right? So that's Keynesian. Let's talk about the classical or neoclassical perspective. They argue that wages and prices adjust fairly quickly in market economies. People also have access to excellent information about what is happening in the economy, so people adjust their behavior in accordance with their expectations about what is going to happen in the economy. The classical perspective, I think a good way to summarize it is they believe the world works exactly like all of our models work, where all of our simple models, they're great. This is exactly what we should do. Over time, it'll fix itself. Everything's going to be okay. Okay, Keynes kind of really focused on the concept of a sticky wage and how that messes up all of these classical models. Okay, so the classical perspective, because prices and wages adjust relatively quickly, which means they adjust really fast, the economy will also adjust back to its normal level of output fairly quickly. They put more weight on greater policies that are going to foster long run growth than on short run policies that aim at combating recessions. So instead of specifically combating recessions or controlling inflationary periods where we have a lot of output, they are going to say, well, we should just focus on the long run and get that long run aggregate supply moving to the right. Okay? So, long run growth policies target institutions that have an ability to affect long run growth. So, government, regulatory agencies, law enforcement, etc. Short run policies, again, they're aimed at combating business cycles. So, short run combats business cycles. Long run, uh, we're looking for long run growth here. Okay. So, classical perspective again, they're much more sensitive to inflation. So, they believe that the Keynesian policy prescriptions don't make much of a difference in terms of the level of output in economy, but they do make a huge difference in inflation. So, as a result, the classical economist encourages a more hands-off approach to dealing with recessions, as eventually, in the long run, prices and wages will adjust to demand shocks and will return to potential output. So essentially, we're in a recession. There's no need to really worry about this too much. We know that over time, everything will adjust very nicely and we'll be back to where we were beforehand. Okay? So they really emphasize the importance of maintaining policies that encourage growth, which inflation is the antithesis of. Wow, I butchered that word. Okay, so as a result, classical economists focus more on what generates increases in the long run aggregate supplies. So the reason why classical economists get called, quote, supply side economics because they are focused on the long run aggregate supply more than the short run. So here's a good summary of differences between the two schools of thought. Keynesians would tend to advocate an acceptable trade-off between inflation and unemployment when counteracting a recession. Neoclassical economists argue that no such trade-off exists because inflation is bad no matter what. So any short-term gains and lower unemployment will eventually vanish, and the result of active policy will only be inflation. Okay. Um, I guess we're just shifting straight into monetary policy. This is more like chapter 13. So monetary policy is shifting aggregate demand around by manipulating the money supply. So we need to understand the role of money, how it's going to play in aggregate demand, aggregate expenditure. We need to understand the role banks play and the Federal Reserve. So, the money supply. We have what's called the Federal Reserve. They conduct monetary policy that controls the money supply. This affects the aggregate demand, and doing this, they set what's called a reserve ratio, which I'm sure we'll talk about. A reserve ratio is essentially like you give money to a bank. I'm not sure if you guys are aware, but if I deposit 100 bucks into a bank, the bank is not just going to sit on that $100 and not do anything with it. In turn, they actually take my $100 or a percentage of it and they go and invest it into other things to try to make more money. And then when you want your $100 out, they'll just pay you $100, right? A reserve ratio is saying how much of the $100 I put in can you go and spend. So if the reserve ratio is say 10%, this means I put in $100, they are allowed to use $90 of it, but they have to have $10 saved in the bank, right? Um, if the reserve ratio is say 0%, then they're just going to take the $100 and they're just going to go invest it elsewhere. This could run into problems because what if my investment doesn't work out and now I can't repay you and now the bank is in trouble? So these are all things that kind of do happen. Um, so banks, they are going to transform liquid assets, such as my $100 that I'm going to invest, into illiquid assets. So they're going to take $90 and they're going to put it into funding a startup, and they won't see the returns on that for 5 years. Okay. So we're going to take in cash, we're going to send out loans, we're going to provide funds to finance investment for firms and individuals. Money, of course, is a big part of monetary policy. Money is any assets that can be used to purchase goods or services. It's most liquid form of an asset. And currency in circulation is what we call cash. Checkable bank deposits are bank accounts for people to write checks. No one writes checks anymore, but you can all send money through Zelle and Venmo and Apple Cash. So it's kind of a bit dated. I wonder if anybody has actually knows how to write a check in this class, because I bet a large majority of you do not. But anyway, moving on. The money supply is the total value of the financial assets in the economy that we consider to be money. So, a median of exchange, or what do we use this money for? Okay, it's a median of exchange, so we use for trading goods and services rather than personal consumption. It's a store of value, meaning of holding purchasing power over time. Obviously, I keep $10 underneath my pillow because I'm trying to store it for the right day to go and buy a coffee, or hopefully two, but probably one because coffee is expensive now. Unit of account is a measure used to set prices and make economic calculations. Okay, so a medium of exchange. An asset that individuals acquire for the purpose of trading rather than their own consumption. Store of value, asset that holds its purchasing power over time. It doesn't depreciate heavily. Years from now, I'll be able to use it to make purchases. People often hold cash as a way to save or insure themselves against risk. Alternatively, people put these into savings accounts. But this is quite literally talking about taking money and putting it in your desk and keeping it there for a long amount of time. Okay, and what's a unit of account is a measure used to set prices and make economic calculations. So people compare prices using money. As a result of comparing prices, they make decisions as to what to buy and how much of it to buy. So an asset is a unit of account if it doesn't frequently exhibit large fluctuations in value. And then it says Bitcoin question mark. So okay. So it says doesn't frequently exhibit large fluctuations in value. Bitcoin is kind of like all over the place. It goes up, it goes down. It's gone up quite a bit since like 2018 or something, but that doesn't mean it's still very going up and down, right? So because it does frequently have large fluctuations in relative value, I would consider it not a unit of account. Um, so there's that. All right, and then money is an asset. An asset is money if and only if is all three of these things. So it's a medium of exchange, a store of value, and a unit of account. So if any one of these conditions does not apply to an asset, then the asset is not money. So there's a couple types of money. We have commodity money, which is a good used as a medium of exchange, and it has some intrinsic value. So this is quite literally going to the grocery store and using a gold bar to buy your groceries, right? Um, Commodity-backed money is the value is guaranteed by a promise that it can be converted into valuable goods. So an example of this is the gold standard. So we were on the gold standard as a country, and what this meant was every dollar correlated to a certain percent or a certain amount of gold, right? And then after World War II, we went into fiat money, which is its the value is derived entirely from its official status as a means of payment, has no intrinsic value, meaning like a $10 bill, if it was just a $10 bill and there, I mean, it's a $10 bill, it doesn't, it's not backed by anything. Okay. The only thing that's giving it value is that people trust that the United States has a good currency. So they're like, oh, okay, United States dollar, that's definitely worth $10. I'll take that from you. Right. No one's going in saying, oh, actually, it's not backed by a gold standard. I can't convert your $10 bill into a portion of gold, so I won't accept it. Okay. So the advantages to fiat money is you have greater control over the economy. It does not use up real resources and it's pretty convenient to use, right? So like These are all great. What's the thing that's kind of scary with fiat money is you have possibilities of hyperinflation. It's not a foolproof way to protect the economy, and unlimited supply can create economic bubbles. So if the United States government just decided overnight, we're going to print a bunch of money and we're just going to throw it out into the economy, it would make it so the dollar would be worth less, right? Um, Hyperinflation occurs when inflation's over, I forget the percent, but it happens frequently in economies, specifically those that have fiat money that are not like well established, such as the US dollar or the euro. And they'll see that their money will essentially become worthless because say I make $10, but then inflation is 1,000%, then I go to the grocery store and I can't buy anything, right? Um, so with fiat money, you run that risk that you could have hyperinflation. And it there with fiat money, it's also kind of a thing of trust between the people in the economy along with the government that they're going to produce enough to have a stable amount of currency without having hyperinflation, and people are going to believe that this dollar is worth $10. Okay. So measuring money supply. So monetary aggregate is the overall measure of the money supply. It adds up everything we consider to be money. Near monies are financial assets that cannot be used as a medium of exchange, but can be converted into cash, checkable bank deposits. They're not as liquid as cash, and they're measured in terms of how long it would take to convert into cash or how much value you lost by converting it immediately. So, like a house is an example. If you have a house, it's worth a lot of money, but it takes a lot of time for you to actually get that money because you have to put it up for sale. It's going to cost you some money to do that, and then you have to sell it, and then you get the payment from the house, but this whole process can take 6 months to a year. Um, so we don't consider a house to be money, essentially. So today, I don't know when today is for this. I think it's like 2021. It's not fully updated. The US currency in circulation is $1,690 billion dollars, or 1.7 trillion. The euros is 1.2 trillion. And Japan has about equivalent to $943 billion dollars because of the exchange rate. It's a lot of money floating around. So what is in the money supply? First, it's easier to see what's not in the money supply. Credit cards. Credit cards don't count. Credit cards are you borrowing money from a certain bank, and then you have to repay the bank. So because you have a credit card that has a credit limit of $5,000, that does not mean you have $5,000. Stocks and bonds are things not in the money supply because these are more form of investments. So what is in the money supply? There's some things that are in the money supply, and they're all quantified by like this M thing. So we have M1, M2. We might have more. Do we have more in this? No, we're only talking M1 and M2. I think it goes to M3 and even M4. Um, but you'll see the trend in this. So M1 is currency, traveler's checks, checkable deposits, basically assets you can use to buy groceries, right? So this money is very liquid. That's the key to M1. M2 is it's all the M1 plus easily convertible near money. So this is money in the savings account would be an M2 because you can't go to the grocery store and use your savings account to buy groceries. You have to transfer from the savings account to the checkings account and then you can go and buy groceries. So it's still easily convertible, but it's not as easy. And then you go into M3 and M4 and the trend kind of continues where in M4, we count everything above, but now it's things that take a while to turn into money, right? Here we have a nice little graph right here. We have the money supply and the monetary bank. So we have bank reserves, the currency in circulation, and then we have checkable bank deposits. Very nice. What's the monetary base? It consists in money held in banks' vaults, the currency that's in circulation, and then the money supplies consist of checkable banks deposit plus the currency in circulation. So although reserves might come from the deposits of individuals, they're not part of checkable deposits as nobody is able to spend it. So the bank has to keep a certain minimum percent of its deposits in its vaults, no matter what its consumers decide to do with their own money. So what's in the money supply? Like we talked about this before, we have M1, we have M2, right? And then we can even draw a bigger circle with M3, and I think it goes to M4. I could be wrong there, right? And again, the key is as the number gets bigger, as it goes from 1, 2 to 3 and 4, um, it becomes, we include more things that take longer to turn into cash or currency you can use to buy groceries. What is not in the money supply? So you can switch funds between your savings and checkings account with a click of a mouse or a call or an automated phone service. But by contrast, converting a stock or a bond into cash requires selling the stock or the bond. That makes these assets much less liquid than bank deposits. So stocks and bonds, unlike bank deposits, they're not considered money. They have fees as well, so you also lose money. Also, what's not in the money supply are credit cards. So we talked about this a little bit, but the credit card company pays the merchant money. You now owe the credit card company money. The limit on the card is part of your loan agreement with the credit card company, so it's not money. Okay, credit cards are not money. Pay off your credit cards. It's great for your credit. If you don't have a credit card, you should get one, and then every month you should pay it off. That's a good way to increase your credit score. Little pro tip right there. Okay. Here we have just a little bit more graphs of M1 and M2 money. So we have currency in circulation, bank deposits, and then this whole circle goes right there into the M2. Right? Very nice. Here's another graph from 2019 where we have currency in circulations and checkable deposits. So where is all the cash? Nearly 3.7 trillion of currency in circulation. That's $6,170 in cash for every man, woman, and child in the United States. How many people do you know carry this much in their wallets? Not many. So where is all the cash? Well, part of the answer is it isn't in individual wallets. It's mostly in cash registers. So most importantly, the Federal Reserve estimates that 60% of the U.S. Currency um, is actually held outside the United States. It's not even held within the United States. So what we're kind of jumping around a lot. We're talking a lot about money. Let's talk about banks a little bit. So banks. What is the role of a bank? Bank is what we call a financial intermediary. So they use liquid assets to finance the e-liquid investments of the borrowers. And this is how market of loanable funds works. So essentially, you give your money to the bank. You say, I want to hold this in the bank. I want 1% back every year. And because it's a savings account, I'm not going to want to take it out right away, right? So the bank's going to say, okay, great. Thank you, Matt. We love that you're using our bank to get your 1%. I'm going to take your money and take a certain percentage of that, and I'm going to invest it into e-liquid investments, such as giving out loans for a firm to build a factory, right? So the bank reserves are currency in the bank's vault plus their deposits at the Federal Reserve, and this is not a part of currency in circulation. The reserve ratio is the fraction of bank deposits that hold as reserve, meaning if the reserve ratio is 10% and I give 100 bucks, then they can spend 90. $90 on investments. Very nice. Very nice. Okay, so banks take in cash, they send out loans. It provides a place to store your cash, provides funds to finance investments for firms. This is kind of what they do. They take our cash and then they give it out to try to invest. And they make money doing this way, right? So if an investment works out for them, say they say, "Yeah, Matt, we'll take your money. We'll give you 1%." I say, "Well, that sounds good to me." And then they're going to take my money and then they're going to use it to invest um, in a startup, and then the startup is going to have to pay back the loan at 5%. So at the end of the day, they make some money from that as well. So banks profit by charging an interest rate on loans. Um, they make it larger than the interest rate they pay out to people who deposit cash with them. It's kind of what I just described there. So they perform an information processing role instead of lending out your money itself. They find firms and do it for you. So they send the money from people who don't need liquidity to those who do. Okay. Banks are good. Use banks, please. So here's the thing, like if I put my money in a savings account, I get 1%. If I go and I try to fund a startup, I probably don't have the funds to do that, right? So what they're going to do is they're going to take my money and a million other people's savings account money, and then they're going to use that to fund the startup. That can get the higher returns, but on my own, I cannot get the higher returns. So I am best off just putting it in a savings account and calling it a day. Also, banks are insured by the FTC, so if something bad happens with that investment, I will still get my money. Um, such problems could be the bank run. So a bank run is money depositors try to withdraw their funds because of the fear of the bank's failure. And what this does is it creates a domino effect from one bank to another or one person to another investing in a bank. So eventually everybody wants their cash because they know that times are getting hard and I don't really trust these banks anymore. So the banks are never going to hold enough money to pay off everyone if they want their money back at the same time. So because of this, bank runs can be a thing. The solution was we have the FDIC with the payback guarantee. So this means that if you bank with a bank that's FDIC guaranteed, this means when I put in money, I will definitely get that money whenever I want it. And if the bank can't pay me, the government will help out the bank. Okay, capital requirements, it's equal to 7% or more of assets. Reserve requirements, minimum reserve ratio is 10% United States, and then a discount window, the Fed's lending facility where the discount rate is applied. So Federal Reserve stands ready to lend money. Okay, so all of these things are controlling banks from using all of your money for investments, right? They are going to be tempted to do so with all these regulations. This helps to make sure that we do not have a lot of bank runs. Bank runs are bad because this is essentially everyone's flooding to the bank. The bank's like, I don't have your money. Okay. So then, um, if it's not FDIC payback guaranteed, this means that I started a savings account 10 years ago. I go to collect my money, and now my money's not there. So I lose all my money. It's a terrible thing. We don't want this to happen. So we have a bunch of regulations in place to make sure this doesn't happen. Um, let's talk about deposit insurance. So this guarantees that a bank's depositor will be paid even if the bank cannot come up with the funds up to a maximum amount per account. The FDIC currently guarantees the first 25 or 250,000 of each account. So this promotes confidence, prevents the run in the first place, and a bank going out of business doesn't mean you lose your money, most importantly. Okay? Uh, Promoting confidence is actually pretty important too because if I know I'm going to get my money back, and then I see that people are like, oh, the times are getting tough and the bank's going through a tough spot, I need to get my money out. Well, I can just be like, well, it's FDIC guaranteed. So I'm gonna get my money back regardless. I can just leave it there. I'm fine leaving it there. Okay, a capital requirement means that regulators require that the owners of banks hold substantially more assets than the value of the bank deposits. In practice, banks' capital is equal to 7% or more of their assets, so that if their assets go south, they have the reserve to pay depositors. This is a great thing. We talked about the reserve requirement. Pretty much this does prevents banks from lending out too big a fraction of their deposits. The discount window is an arrangement in which the Federal Reserve stands ready to lend money to banks in trouble. The Fed will lend even if no one else will. So that's a great thing about our Fed government, the monetary Jerome Powell. Um, is we have this window, meaning that we will help out people in these banks. Why do, I guess a question that you may ask is like, why do countries even want these like banks to be a thing? Like they seem to just be causing problems. There's bank runs is terrible. Well, remember, banks are a good source of lending for investment, right? So a firm that wants to start a business, build a factory, they're going to go to a bank for a loan to do this. This is going to help out our economy. And so we want these banks to be able and comfortable to be making as many investments as possible. We're going to put these regulations on these banks to, one, make sure the bank is being somewhat responsible, and then two, make sure that consumers feel safe giving their money to a bank. Okay, let's talk about a T account. So a T account is a tool for analyzing businesses' financial position by showing in a single table the business's assets and liabilities. So for example, Silas deposits $1,000 into a checkable account at First Street Bank. Suppose the reserve is 10%. Show in the First Street Bank the initial effect show the First Street Bank after making as many loans as legally possible. Okay, so the initial effect before the bank makes a new loan is now they have reserves of $1,000, right? Because I just gave them $1,000, so that goes into the reserve, which is an asset. Their liability is they owe me that $1,000 whenever I want it. Okay. Um, because we have this 10% reserve ratio, this means that I can take out of the $1,000, I can take 1,000 times 0. I'll make this more official. 1 minus the reserve ratio, which gives me 900. So I can hand out loans that are worth 900, and I have my reserves that are negative 900 now. So here's how banks create money. Again, the first stage is Silas keeps cash under his bed. Okay, so we're saying this Silas is going through a lot right here. So he's going to keep cash under his bed. So the currency in circulation is just 1,000, which means the money supply is 1,000. Okay. Now he's going to go to First Street Bank, which lends out $900 to Maya, who then pays it to Anne. Okay, so Silas again deposits this $1,000, and now the bank can lend out $900 to Maya, and Maya is going to pay Anne. So now our money supply is 1,900. Anne is going to deposit $900 into the Second Street Bank, which is going to lend out 810. Why 810? Because that's 900 times zero point 0.9. Um, and then that bank is going to lend it out to another borrower. So now our money supply jumps by 810. You can see there's kind of a pattern that's going to emerge here. So removing currency from circulation is one of the tools that banks control the money supply. The other is creating money from accepting deposits, making loans. And then we have a money multiplier process. So if we increase excessive reserves by $1, This means the $1 divided by the reserve ratio in new money, where RR is reserve ratio, right? So we can take this here. We can keep going with this process all the way down, and then we can say, okay, there's originally $1,000. Our ratio was zero point 0.1, so this should actually create $10,000 in money. Okay, and here it is. Um, if you're into math, this is actually a sequence where this is kind of a lot, but it's 1,001 minus RR to the t, where t goes to 1 to infinity, and this converges to 100 over R. Very nice. Okay, so the excess reserves are bank reserves over and above the bank's required reserves. The bank wants to lend these out. Lending out excess reserves is how the bank is gonna make money. Okay, so again, this is just kind of all talking about this big formula right here. So the firm is going to get a loan. They're going to spend money. That money goes to somebody else's bank account. Some of the money gets lent out because it's in a bank, this financial intermediary. It's not underneath the pillow. So with that money, the firm gets a loan, and then they spend money, and the process continues and continues. So the original dollar in cash means many dollars in new money. And it's all determined by this nice formula right here. Okay, we have a couple exercises here, and then we are calling it a lecture. So suppose Daniel makes $5,000 deposit to Chase Bank. The reserve ratio is set by the Federal Reserve, 25%, pretty steep. All right, depict the effect of Chase Bank's D account when Daniel deposits the money before any new loans are made. Identify both required and excess reserves. Okay, so now we have reserves, which is $5,000. And then I'll just say we have to pay him out, and that's $5,000. Very nice. Let's, okay, so now Chase makes as many loans as he legally can. Um, to pick Chase's bank's T account after these changes. So again, we have $5,000, but there's a 25% reserve. So this means that I can lend out $5,000 times 0.75, which is 1 minus 25%. So that means that I have $3,750, and we're just gonna go back right here to make sure this is all right. Yes. Uh, so I take $3,750 out of my reserves, but now I have $3,750, which are loans. Okay. If this new loan is eventually fully deposited back into the banking system and each subsequent deposit is eventually fully loaned back, how much does the money supply change in total as a result of the annual deposit, and what will the balance sheet of the entire banking system, including Chase Bank, look like? Okay, I'm not going to so worry about this. Let's just see how far does this $5,000 get us? How much does it increase the money supply? Well, again, we are going to look at this equation. So this equation is deposit over reserve ratio equals the change in money supply. Again, change is this triangle that we call delta. There's a better triangle right there. So the original deposit was 5,000. Reserve ratio is 0.25. So the change in the money supply here is going to be 20,000. Okay, that's kind of a big key for this question. And just leave it there. That's all we need to do for today. Okay, so we are done with week 7. I'll see you guys for week 8. Yeah, see you guys then.